then a quick one on the communications with protests and people related to protests. Has the president spoken to Mayor Adams since the NYPD became involved in dealing with them?
Understand the question, don't have anything to read out as far as a conversation with the mayor from the president, but I think we've been very, very clear about what we're seeing on the ground. I've been answering these questions for the past couple of days. Go ahead.
Thank you.
You said the president is monitoring the situation. Is he aware of the reports that a fair number of the people arrested on several campuses are not students?
Look, that is something for obviously local government to speak to, local police and law enforcement to speak to, and what they're seeing and what they're reporting. That is something that I can't speak to at this time. I've heard that reporting, but that is something for them to speak to at this time.
But he's not aware of that.
Well, he's getting regularly updated on the situation and monitoring. So I assume that that's part of his update, but he is getting regularly updated on what's happening across the country and campuses.
That was White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre addressing journalists during a press briefing on May 2nd about the student protests that broke out across campuses in the United States. The students are protesting the ongoing war that's across the globe, where the Israel Defense Force, directed by Israel's far-right government, and its Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who vowed a full-on retaliation against Hamas, a Palestinian militant group that stormed from the blockade Gaza Strip into nearby Israeli towns, killing dozens and abducting others in an unprecedented surprise attack on October 7th. The final death toll from the attack is now thought to be 695 Israeli civilians, including 36 children as well as 373 security forces and 71 foreigners, giving a total of 1,139, according to news reports. But as of May 13, 2024, over 36,000 people, 35.2 thousand Palestinian and 1.4 thousand Israelis have been reportedly killed in the Israel-Hamas war. This includes 97 journalists. 92 of them are Palestinians, 2 Israeli and 3 Lebanese, and over 224 humanitarian aid workers, including 179 employees of the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. With the Israeli military campaign showing no sign of stopping, the human casualties of this conflict are becoming unbearable for many to witness, including university students who are demanding their schools and universities to divest from weapons manufacturers and companies profiting from Israeli violence against Palestinians and to stop repressing pro-Palestinian advocacy on campus. To unpack this reaction, I speak with 2 individuals, a human rights activist who has been deeply involved in rallies in the United States for years, and a journalist from New York who witnessed the first protests that sparked a movement across campuses globally. My name is Irishi. You are listening to The Divide.
My name is Kafia Ahmed. I'm an activist and organizer from the United States.
I'm Alex Shephard. I'm a senior editor at The New Republic, where I cover politics.
Kafia Ahmed is an organizer for over 20 years, and she's done every kind of organizing you can imagine, including immigration, housing, prison abolition, and now solidarity with Palestine. Alex Shephard is a senior editor of The New Republic, an online magazine and daily news platform where he has covered politics and culture since 2015. I asked both of them to describe what's happening on U.S. campuses.
Around a month ago, students at Columbia University in Manhattan and New York City started an encampment on a lawn on campus. There are, I think at first, about 100 of them. It grew a bit. And it attracted nationwide attention. There were immediately allegations of harassment. Largely those, I think almost exclusively, those were happening actually off campus. But the encampment itself became a kind of focus point for a larger conversation about discourse surrounding Israel's bombing and military campaigns in Gaza. And that encampment very quickly and organically spread across the country. So essentially, within a week, I think there were more than 100 encampments at universities and colleges across the country. And they became a sort of, there's been a larger political firestorm over discourse on campus surrounding Israel and what it's doing in Gaza for quite a while. It had already led to the resignation of Harvard's president, thanks to congressional inquiries into alleged anti-Semitism on campus. But then it really became a huge flashpoint. So you had some colleges and universities, most notably Wesleyan and Cornell, another Ivy League school, that kind of just did nothing, just sort of sat back and just said, look, these kids can just hang out and say whatever they want. But there was an enormous amount of political pressure and pressure from donors at other colleges, again, most notably Columbia, that led to essentially the colleges and universities calling in the police, in many cases, many hundred riot police, to clear these encampments, to arrest the students that were involved. And we're now at a point where this is going to become immaterial because colleges are notably going on summer break. But I think the reason why it became so controversial is that there's been a larger debate over, progressive voices in academia already. And again, there's been a related debate over, I think, contested allegations of anti-Semitism. And this just became a huge flashpoint in which both of those things combined and created an extraordinarily complicated, but also very, very volatile political situation.
Right now, across the United States, students have set up what they're calling encampments, which are essentially retaking space that the university owns and that the students essentially pay for through their tuition dollars. These encampments are in the tradition of activists from the civil rights movement, from the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s. And they're essentially asking that these universities act on what they teach kids to do every day, which is to make sound moral judgments based on knowledge and information that they're being given. And through a series of escalating actions, the students are making demands of these institutions, primarily demands around the divestment of the endowment of these universities from not just the Israeli state that is committing genocide in Palestine, but divestment from weapons manufacturers and from other institutions that have made their money from the perpetuation of war. There's also calls that are being asked, that are being brought about around making sure that that American universities are supporting the universities in Gaza and in the occupied West Bank, because as we now know, every single university in Gaza has been bombed. There is not a single educational institution left. It is what is referred to as scholarcide. And there's asked by these students also to take in those scholars, to support the work of Palestinian academics, and to make sure that their knowledge continues on beyond this current state of violence that they're experiencing.
As Kafia and Alex explain what is happening on U.S. campuses to me, there's something that really baffles me. How are schools and universities able to invest in weapons manufacturing or a foreign state?
Yeah, so in general, I don't think that companies themselves are invested in states per se, but they are invested in companies within those states, or companies that may be providing weapons to Israel, or who may be involved in Israel's current essentially blockade of Gaza, or just what, again, protesters allege is a sort of essentially an apartheid state. American universities are essentially hedge funds with colleges attached to them. They have huge endowments, often totaling many billions of dollars. And the presidents of these colleges exist to essentially oversee those endowments. They attract donations from usually wealthy alumni or other people who want to be associated with the school in some way. And that money is then invested into companies. So companies like like Raytheon or something, companies that make missiles, and that's done on a sort of neutral, or not neutral, but it's done because the colleges want to keep making money, and that money is obviously not used to lower tuition. It's occasionally used to build buildings on campus, but even those largely come from donors. It mostly just exists as this kind of like large pool of money that the colleges derive their prestige and status from.
And here's Kafia Ahmed.
That's a really good question. And I think that's actually the primary question that everyone should be asking. It's a question that I do not actually have the answer to. Why is almost every single educational institution in the United States invested in the state of Israel, in weapons manufacturers? That is a fantastic question to ask because it really makes no sense. And it really brings to bear the concept that these educational institutions, the educating part is kind of a side project. Their primary function at this point is that they are profit-making schemes for these regents and these trustees and these people who will invest their money in pretty much anything that makes them money. The endowments of these institutions, some of them are greater than the GDPs of the vast majority of countries in this world. And that is only really accomplished through the unethical investment of student tuition and the money that they make into these large-scale systems that only exist to profit a certain few, those who are really at the top. And what I find really interesting, whether it's weapons manufacturers or fossil fuel industries, is I think it's interesting that these institutions are investing in businesses and in models of business that are essentially making it so that these young people don't have a future. So you're educating them, and you're around the premise that they're going to contribute to the world at large, and that they're going to be the leaders of the future. But you're invested in fossil fuel industries and in weapons manufacturing and in all these systems and schemes that are essentially guaranteeing that if they continue unimpeded, there is no future for them to be leaders of. There is no planet for them to save, let alone lead. So it's a very interesting thought experiment when you're like, what is actually the point of these institutions if they have a financial incentive for maintaining the current status, the current system as it exists? Of course, it almost makes sense that they would attack their own students and that they would call these violent police departments on them. Of course, it makes sense that the answer to any kind of dissent is nothing but quelling that dissent, because you're messing with their bottom line. At the end of the day, it's a profit-making scheme, more so than an educational institution.
It's largely just a sort of gigantic pool of money, right? So it's essentially a source of funding in perpetuity. So Harvard is funded by the endowment, right? It's not funded by tuition per se. It is, but tuition goes into this fund, which is then invested, and then the college then takes that money and provides the service of education from it. I think Harvard's endowment is something like $50 billion now. And, in large part, it's just the Dow just hit 40,000, right? So these colleges have started, I think for the most part, they started investing this money in the mid-1980s. So to some extent, it just reflects larger growth in the stock market itself. But it also reflects, large donations made by alumni and other prominent people. And every college that is prestigious in some way has a large, usually multi-billion-dollar endowment.
Multi-billion-dollar endowment that's been used by universities to invest in businesses and companies that manufacture weapons. But some of the schools are reaching agreements with student protesters, pledging to take certain steps in exchange for the dismantling of their encampments.
What we're largely seeing is the colleges that have negotiated with demonstrators have often come to an agreement that their board of trustees will consider proposals to divest from arms manufacturers. I believe a few have decided to invest from them. I think that two things are likely to happen here. I think that they don't want to be seen to be agreeing to the demands of protesters, and I think it'd be hugely controversial for them too. I think you're not going to see a college or university that divests fully from Israel. It's just not going to happen. But I do think in the medium term, or even maybe the short term, you will see a slow pullback from large scale weapons manufacturers, because I think that it's not worth the controversy. And again, it's ridiculous, right? The idea that Columbia University has, we'll say multiple hundreds of millions, a large amount of money invested in essentially, the defense industrial complex is crazy, and it creates real potential conflicts. And again, it's contrary to the mission of educating students, but it does say something, I think, about just the transformation of private education, but really all education in America over the last 40 years to a model that is reliant on investment. And again, essentially, Columbia is a hedge fund.
Another hedge fund, Brown University, has reached an agreement with the student protesters by committing to a vote on divesting from Israel-affiliated companies.
I think the impact of these votes will be very similar. We have a great example in the mid-1980s in the South African anti-apartheid movement, which is, essentially the same, which is, a state acting violently and unethically towards its own population and operating as an apartheid system, and students making demands of their institutions to divest. So I think what will happen is that if the students and faculty voices are heard, then these institutions will divest, and they will divest completely. If they are really meaningfully engaging with this and it's a fair vote, I believe that's what will happen. And then from there, I think these institutions will be fine, because they are extraordinarily wealthy, and they will find other places to invest their funds. Hopefully, this time they won't just kind of shuffle around their funds to the next deeply unethical stream of revenue, and they will actually think about how to invest in a way that is healthy and healthful, and that seeks to make our world better versus benefiting from the lowest common denominator. But yeah, I think these institutions, not even eventually, I think these institutions will be just fine, and this will have very little impact on their long-term financial health.
And finally, here's Alex, seeing how these protests are going to affect the U.S.'s domestic politics as well as the upcoming election.
I think the big unknown here is what's going to happen in the fall. So you're going to have the Democratic National Convention is happening in mid-August, which is essentially right when these kids go back to school, when a lot of students go back to school. So if Israel is continuing to drop bombs on Gaza, which seems reasonably likely, I could easily see this firing back up in a few months, and that will coincide with the period in which the U.S. presidential election is also heating up. And there will be an enormous amount of anxiety about Joe Biden's approval rating and popularity with young voters at that point. So I think that this is going to sort of fall back a little bit between now and the Democratic Convention, which I think is from August 15th to 18th. But starting in mid-August, this could just come back, as strong, if not stronger than what you've seen before.
Thank you for listening. This episode of The Divide is produced by Radio Taiwan International.